So when you introduce the disabled spaces and autistic spaces and neurodivergent spaces, there's a ton of vocabulary and terms that come up. And here I'm going to give you a rough overview of the big ones that come up a lot, especially acronyms, because acronyms can be very hard to look up and especially intimidating because they don't have, you can't say them as well because there's a bunch of letters. Now, there isn't a really good order for this, and this is just a quick introduction so you feel less intimidated. The first one I will start off with is ADHD tax. So this is the idea that people with ADHD have to spend more money or time on stuff because of such ideas as like they might buy food but forget about the food, and the food spoils, so then they have to buy more food. So that's an extra expensive food. So maybe they still bought more expensive food, but less of it than a big deal food. Maybe they get distracted and forget to take their meds, and then they get sicker later on, which means they have to take more meds later on, and so on and so on. But it's just the extra expenses of having ADHD. And then they have to, in their daily lives, calculate this and figure out maybe it's not worth buying the more expensive thing instead of the bulk product because they won't forget about it or something like that. Another one that's more recent I've seen is AuDHD, and that is for people that are both autistic and ADHD, which is a huge overlap. I've heard up to 40%. I don't know if that number is fully true or not. I would believe it, and it's also, it might be underdiagnosed in some cases, oftentimes because people don't want to go through the full testing of both ones. And the reason why we add AU, simply the U is ADHD, obviously, but then the U is from AU. AU is a symbol we oftentimes use for autism because it's the first two letters of autism and autistic. So next one I want to go over is SPIN, or SPIN, and S is capital and I is oftentimes capital, not always, and that stands for special interest. Special interest is stuff that autistic people sometimes other neurodivergent pertains to, we find specifically interesting. It's and it's not just like an interest like, oh yeah, it's a hobby or something. It's like we like to call our whole room that way. We have a lot of toys and merchandise. We spend hours researching. It's a very important thing to us and who we are. Special interests can change. They can develop at any time in life, and you can lose a special interest. But when you have it as a special interest, it's a huge deal that you put a lot of effort into and becomes a huge part of your identity, at least momentarily. The other one, next one I want to go over is STEM. So STEM is STIM. It's kind of acronym, kind of not. It stands for self-stimulation. And people also talk about stimming, which is when you do it. Get out of your mind and forget that it's nothing dirty, but it's like playing with your hair, tapping on the desk, or anything that you do to get in some sensory input to help calm or regulate yourself or feel good or think things through. And the sensory input you're doing is, or to express yourself, but the sensory input you're doing is something you're not doing on a very conscious basis. You're not thinking about doing it. Like the difference between humming can be a stem or singing can be a stem, but then you're not really thinking about the singing or humming, not caring about the tune, not caring about the words. You might mess up. You're just going with the flow. If you're tapping on the desk, it might be the beat and stuff is helping you relax, but you're not trying to drum a fancy drum roll or something. Maybe you're watching videos, but you're watching it just as eye candy, just to see the images and stuff. You're not thinking about the plot or anything. It's all about the sensory input. It's all about just at the most basic level. Most stims are harmless and safe and really important for people to do because, again, it helps regulate them. And stims can be with any senses. Suppressing them, though, is very, very hard. So next one I want to go over is AA. And AA stands for actually autistic. This is a self-identifier for people online to say, hey, I'm autistic. These self-identifiers came about because a lot of people are talking about autism stuff that weren't autistic, and it came out about saying, hey, I'm actually autistic, listen to me, compared to this random Joe on the internet. Now, I do want to say that that self-diagnosis is completely valid, and it's not like fake autistics online. So a lot of people that use AA are self-diagnosed, and that's fully valid because the diagnosis system is messed up by far and really hard to access for many people. So yes, and it should only be used by autistic people to identify themselves. The other one is AU, sometimes with a little carrot on top. Well, oftentimes a little carrot on top like this, or two carrots on top. And this little pointy thing on top, it's used for autistic people to self-identify in their name as they're actually autistic, or in other things like that. And the thing about AU is it's something that a lot of autistic people add to the names online especially. In some other places they might add it to the names, but it's really especially online that you see it. And again, it's something that should primarily only be used by autistic people, because they're the people saying, hey, I'm taking pride in my identity. This is my new name online. So another diagnosis I want to briefly mention is GAD, which stands for General Anxiety Disorder. General anxiety disorder, it's much more common in disabled and autistic community, but not everyone with it. Not everyone in that community by far has it. And what it stands for is general anxiety disorder again. It's kind of like if sadness and loneliness is to depression as like anxiety is to this. It's a person that has extreme anxiety, all the more extreme anxiety, and it isn't like a specific trigger mostly. It has become a very generalized one that there isn't as much of a trigger. Now there could be triggers that make it much worse. It's much more constant in their life. It can vary, and they have trouble coming to a calm, good state. DSM, and sometimes you see DSM with various numbers. Next one is totally different topic, but DSM. DSM sometimes has various numbers after it, and stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But don't worry, it doesn't really have to do with math, if you're worried about that. It is what the US and a couple other countries use mainly to diagnose someone and with different brain disorders, neurotypes and stuff. It is really messed up, but it's the only diagnostic, but it's used by a lot of professionals, so you have to kind of know it. Until very recently, trans and being gay and all that stuff was seen as a mental illness in it. The criteria is still super biased and from external things, and often contradicts what the actual community within it says about it. And also, a lot of people that are professional clinicians and stuff don't always use a DSM, or they use an older version, or they use parts of DSM or not other parts of it. So it gets really, really confusing. But it's something to definitely be aware of. And it also DSM doesn't recognize a lot of things that a lot of people consider legit disorders like CPSD, and it has ones that other people, like it just doesn't recognize CPSD, which I'll go to. It recognizes AuDHD, but doesn't recognize PDA, which is also controversial, which I'll get to. So be aware of it. And please do not call it the Holy Bible or something like that. Some people make Bible analogies, and that's totally wrong. So, next one. Twice exceptional, EE, however you want to say it. This is something that's quite common people diagnosed, but there's some disability that's recognized, and then they're also seen as gifted. Now, gifted is a very controversial term. What I want to say is that it's gifted by the academic system or the system they're in. It doesn't actually mean people without this, that calling this, they're not called twice E, doesn't mean they're not gifted. Doesn't mean they don't have great talents. It's that the system doesn't recognize their talents in some way. And it's all about like more how the system views you than actual reality. So people that are gifted are more likely to be, in other ways, yes, they're disabled, but in other ways privileged. So a white male is more likely to be seen as twice E, or gifted in ways. And that has nothing to do with real neurotypes. And then there's so many different potential gifts that we don't recognize because they're not in the same fitting of academics or something, or in the same space, in the cutoffs. So yeah, the gifted part is one. And many people that are diagnosed with twice E get a lot of supports that denied or help because they're gifted, and they just don't recognize that. So it's a lot of people that get diagnosed twice E feel objectified and feel like they don't get the help they need, and they make jokes about the gifted kid that gets depressed. So I really do not like that term, but it does lead to a certain type of people having a certain commonality in life. Now, a lot of parents and stuff that are not diagnosed twice E love it. I think they love it because they like to recognize the kid as he and the kid is gifted and stuff. And people with that diagnosis hate it because of all the troubles they get. So maybe don't go around boasting about your kid being gifted, all that stuff, when it can lead to a certain amount of hardships. Talk about more like, oh, they have particular talents and stuff, not just, oh, my kid is the most brilliant kid out there. Because a lot of us regret that later on. Hearing that. So GI, that stands for gastrointestinal. I don't want to get into the medical science of it, but that just means your whole stomach, intestines, all the thing that helps you digest. And a lot of people that are disabled or autistic or neurodivergent have issues there. A lot of people, for some reason, do not know that acronym, and that was surprising to me. So ADS and ED can stand for something that is kind of, I'm not going to talk about because I don't know how YouTube feels about it, but it can also, EDS can stand for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I'm not the best at saying that, so I'm going to spell it here. And that's a common thing that many autistic people have that causes joint and ligament and connective tissue issues, and can cause increased flexibility, more bruising, more chance that stuff gets sprained or something. Doesn't necessarily. It can also stand for executive dysfunction in some times. I don't know if that's confusing or not, but yeah. Executive dysfunction means that the ability to do everyday tasks is basically disrupted because of either focus issue, memory problems, organizational issues, stuff like that. More basic ones. And it's not about you not being physically capable of doing it. ED more commonly stands for executive dysfunction. It's ED alone, not EDS. Sometimes people say Ehlers-Danlos syndrome as ED. And excuse me if I mispronounce a lot of these words. So BPD/NPD. So BPD stands for borderline personality disorder, which I'm not an expert on, but a lot of people with BPD are ashamed about it, and having personality disorder does not in any way make you an awful person or make you more abusive or anything. It, from what I understand from BPD in this community, so more speak for themselves. The part of the cluster B personality disorders is that they have issues with loneliness and feeling, and they oftentimes feel abandoned and stuff like that, and they can get kind of issues with all that stuff surrounding that. NPD is another personality disorder, and again, most people with NPD are not abusive, and a lot of people with the abusive do not have NPD and stop associating the two together and stop using the word narcissism like that. NPD stands for narcissistic personality disorder. A lot of abusive people are not narcissists, so please stop using it that way, and vice versa. and that community gets to speak more for themselves. SID or SD, now I'm not saying SID is sudden infant death syndrome, but SID and SD I've both seen as ways that people say self-diagnosed. As a disclaimer, another one is sometimes I see SDX. Now SDX and SD, and X sometimes is not capital when it's SDX, can also stand for standard deviation, which is a statistical term, but I don't see it often used in that space like that, except for on like diagnosis clinician stuff. SPD is sensory processing disorder. That is a broad range of different disorders, and it means that you process your senses radically different than other people, in that it can be that you're hyposensitive, so you're not very sensitive to that. It can be you're hypersensitive, so you're very sensitive. But all this, or it can be something more complex, like sometimes you're hypo, sometimes you're hyper, or that you have synesthesia and your senses are fused, so a touch triggers a smell sensation, or maybe that you don't think, or maybe you can't separate sounds as much well, like auditory processing disorder, which I'll get to. Maybe you can't recognize certain things as well, but other things you can recognize better. Somehow how you mess up, you work with your senses is completely different than a normal person. Now, almost everyone that's autistic has SPD. Some people include in the diagnosis criteria. And SPD is probably one of the most common disorders with the widest range of varieties. And talking about how SPD is something quite often in neurodivergent she's talked about when you're getting to know friends, because it's very important to the identity. That's another problem. The thing with SPD is a really big part of your identity by definition, because it's how you process the world around you. So it's people with SPD, it's not that the senses are different, it's different so much that it impacts their daily life to an extreme extent. Oh yeah, one last thing about SPD. I'm sorry for going on with SPD. SPD is also different than being blind, hard of hearing or something. They can overlap, but it's not a physical difference in the body. It's a neurological difference. APD is auditory processing disorder, and it's a specific subtype of SPD that has to do with listening to sounds. And then people with it cannot process sounds as well. And it can happen in many ways, in that maybe they can't separate sounds as well. So if there's a lot of background noise of people talking, they can't recognize the sounds as well. They may have trouble memorizing vocal things. So if people speak quotes or something that people are speaking, they might take them longer to figure out what you're saying, or they might need repeats. These things can become more extreme when they're tired or overwhelmed. And it can be overwhelmed by other senses, like the lights are too bright, so you can't hear, or something like that can really happen. But it's all about like auditory processing. And it also can affect like people with it might not be able to hear tunes or stuff in music as well. So ODD, which I wish I could just say odd, oppositional defiant disorder, is something recognized in the DSM in the US, but a lot of places don't recognize it outside the country, and it's a little messed up terminology in my opinion, and in many other ones, because it's all about behavior instead of the actual person, and that's a person that is seen by the system as being defiant or oppositional, but we never ask why in this one. Oftentimes because, is it due to extreme anxiety? Could they actually physically not do it? I've seen people label with this that physically can't do a thing, but then they'll get this label. It's like, no, they have difficulties. Maybe they just don't conform to you in other ways. Maybe they actually are defiant. Maybe they're just very independent. Maybe you just don't like them. So like, there are people with it, with real issues, but it really doesn't tell you anything about that person, how they think or something like that, which is why I really do not like the term. PDA, on the other hand, is a real diagnosis in neurotype and stuff in many ways. And a lot of people more self-identify with that. And it's recognized more in countries like the UK and stuff. And that's pathological demand avoidance. Some people do not like the name of it, which is true. I can see problems with the name. PDA is someone that has extreme anxiety with following orders or commands or doing stuff. So they try to avoid demands or orders or commands, or if they do it, they might rebel because of the anxiety it causes. Now, oftentimes, though, if you put them in a setting that is not demanding or ordering around, they can be very open, they can be very hardworking on their own, and stuff like that. If you demand less of them, they're more likely to listen to the demands you do give them. Stuff like that. Don't stress these people out, and they will become more responsive instead of trying to beat them down. So the next two terms are very much related, and that is IEP and EHCP. So IEP is Individualized Education Plan. The IEP is a plan that we put in place for someone's education in school or somewhere else to tell them that they have specific accommodations such as extra time on tests, writing aids, or anything you can think of. Sometimes it's a legal binding document, sometimes it's not. It can vary very much from your locality, state to state, to the school system, to within the school system, to within the individual, and all the exact rules and how binding it is. In the US, it is not binding after high school, but in high school, it can be a legal document, but afterwards, not at all, which is kind of very problematic because a lot of professors just don't follow people's IEPs. And IEPs are necessary oftentimes, and they are good many times, and they get people what they need, but oftentimes they are an excuse not to give kids aids they need if they don't have an IEP, and IEPs can take a very, very long time to get. Besides them being an excuse not to deny people help, IEPs can also are usually not very much individualized for the person, even despite the name. They usually stand on things like, oh, you have extra time on a test, but you don't have the aids that will actually help you on a test, such as special scratch paper or writing aids, or they use it to not give you that, like a very specific accommodation, or not to listen to the student themselves or the parent. They just look at the IEP. Another one is sometimes you look at the IEP and be like, I don't like this student, and in the worst cases, IEPs can actually have harmful things in it, like forced eye contact and stuff like that. So while IEPs are necessary now, they have importance. There's a lot of messed up stuff with them in the system. EHCP is something very similar, and it's another plan about that. That's just a different term used in different places and different settings. Okay, so this is something quite often seen online, autistic and disabled spaces and neurodivergent spaces, but actually doesn't have as much to do with a diagnosis, but that's DDD, or dirty delete. That's when someone deletes the comments in the thread, which can make other comments disappear, but gets rid of education and learning for other ones, which can be really hurtful because other people now have to repeat the same thing over and over again, and it's really tiring and stuff. It also shows that you don't want to take responsibility for your stuff. So please don't delete your comment unless the people in that OP or something specifically ask you to delete it. NT stands for neurotypical, and that's like a person with a normal brain, as opposed to ND, which is neurodivergent. And a neurodivergent is someone with a brain that is very different than a normal person in some way. Now, it includes autistic is one of the most commonly cited ones, but it includes ADHD, people with learning disabilities, specific learning disabilities, and much more. It can be both genetic, so it's something you're born with, or acquired from like a brain injury, which, again, autism, ADHD and stuff, none of those are brain injury caused, but I'm talking about like having having speech problems and stuff like that, or memory issues because you got hit in the head, for example, or a stroke. There's numerous things you can name. So ARFID, or ARFID, is now another diagnosis I'm getting into. And this is the 24th thing I'm talking about. And ARFID is a problem with when you have a restrictive diet, and not all restrictive diets are bad, which means that you only eat certain types of food or drinks, and that it actually causes health problems. Now, it doesn't matter always about the calories. It could be a nutrient deficiency of some sort. It could be it upsets your stomach too much. And it's not about the quantity as much you eat, is that your diet is not diverse enough, or that you get too picky to a certain extent that you don't get enough calories. But it's only ARFID if it's really is a problem with your health at this point. Treating it, there's a lot of groups about it and stuff, but again and again, people emphasize that forcing people to eat certain foods, this actually does not help in this case. You might think it helps, but it doesn't, because a lot of these people would rather starve to death than eat the foods. What we have found that helps people is lowering pressure on them. The less pressure they have, people are more open to eating more things and trying new things. So it's making their life all around less anxious and stressful. Slowly introducing foods on the side where the safe food they will eat is there. For some people, will have to take supplements or tube feeding or something like that to get enough food. Another one that people found to help is figuring out what they don't like. So vegetables, fruits and stuff can come in so many different textures and stuff, and inconsistency can be very alarming to certain people. But if you make a smoothie or a sauce out of it, or if you make a pancake like this vegetable pancakes, maybe you can expand the diet that way without too much pressure. Sometimes having them cook or prepare the food makes them less anxious about it. But sneaking it and trying to be secretive about all this stuff is actually some of the worst thing possible, because then they start being suspicious of other foods and everything in the long run, and when they find out, and they might become even more restrictive. Other ideas is that somehow, with the permission and knowledge, you find stuff that tastes better, that has healthy alternatives, there's more fiber or vitamins or supplements in it. But that's always, they have to be on board. No sneaking. And if you have a really bad case of it, please talk to a professional dietitian and doctor to make sure that figure out what they really are missing. And there's also feeding therapy for it. So another one that I want to talk about is EC that you might find here, which is eye contact. It's used to talk about how eye contact is not important oftentimes. 26 is OP, and that's just the main offer of the big thing, post or anything that people are applying to. Another one that you might commonly see is ST, which is speech therapy. You can also see sometimes SLT, which is, speech therapist is ST, SLT, which is speech language therapy, and SLP, which is speech language pathology. And they're all kind of around the same idea. But something weird that I want to emphasize about it is that it's not always about verbal spoken language, even though they say speech. Oftentimes a good therapist will give you alternative speech that are not like AACs or hand sign language or stuff like that. And for a lot of people, that even if they can speak, this can help them communicate better by getting rid of stress and pressure, and might be their preferred means. And a good one will try to figure out what works best for the individual, not for them or what society wants. So OT is occupational therapist, and they mainly work on skills to make or movement or stuff with moving the body or sensory things to improve the lives of the individual. And a good OT does that. A bad OT will try to make them fit into society, stuff like that. But good OT will be like, oh, you can't tie your shoes. let's try slip-on shoes instead. They'll come up with alternatives. They won't force you down the typical route, but it's making your life better, because now you don't have to have the other people put on your shoes and tie it. You can have more agency or feel comfort, and they really focus on you, not society, if they're good. PT stands for physical therapy, and that has very much to do with moving and joint stuff and muscle stuff. ASD. So ASD is autism spectrum disorder. It's something that a lot of autistic people do not like to hear because of the term spectrum being controversial in disorder. And we prefer either AA, AU, or just calling us autistic straight up. AAC is augmentative alternative communication device, and that's any method or device used to communicate that's not speaking. And it can be as simple as a whiteboard to write down stuff or draw pictures. It can be flashcards. It can be a tablet that they can use. It can be signs and hand symbols and gestures. It can be a wide variety of things. ASL is American Sign Language. There are also other sign languages out there. Then we have also, along with ASL, the next one we have is CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which exactly the difference between that and PTSD. They're both mental illnesses and bad, but CPTSD is made by multiple complex traumas usually compared to PTSD. It's like your whole life you were in an abusive family that gave you so much trauma, or you were suffered that systematic discrimination in the system, and becomes really part of, interacts with identity in a more complex way. It's hard to unravel because it affects you in so many ways. Then there's a single bad event, and oftentimes PTSD, you say, oh, you were in a bad car crash or had a medical disaster, and then that car crash or medical disaster, you can say that, oh, it's unlikely to happen to you ever again, blah, blah, and we can start talking about logically that's unlikely that something that bad will happen to you again. When in CPTSD, if you grew up in an abusive environment, you could be abused again. If you have systematic discrimination, you could face it again. So these traumas are much less things we can deny that they won't happen again. And they very might as well be. So I just sometimes think about it as like the mental illness of minority, because they're the ones that usually suffer it because of all the discrimination they face. Another one I like to talk about is PTS, which PTS is post-traumatic stress, and it's like an event that happens due to PTSD or CPTSD or something, but not always necessarily with it, but it is after a traumatic event happens, you get stressed out, and it causes you to have some problems, a panic attack, disillusion, you become disillusioned, or you can't focus anymore, an anxiety attack, or a million different other things. But it's an event that happens, it's an event that happens not enough times for it to become a PTSD or CPSD, or it is the one event within the PTSD, CPSD framework. Then there's POTS, which is a thing that where people change positions, so from sitting down to standing up to laying down, and the heart rate suddenly goes up or down, and blood pressure changes suddenly. This can cause fainting or collapse or dizziness and stuff like that. And it's a lot more autistics, especially, but also other neurodivergents have it. It's more common in biologically females. You know, it can occur in anyone, but it's a lot more common in biological females. And it can be very debilitating, but it has a wide range of severities. It can also be something, it is possibly genetic, we don't fully understand it. And it's also something that can start occurring later in life. It usually starts occurring, it usually gets increased in severity in puberty and in early 20s. SEN, or SEN or SPED, or SPED, that's special education, or special education unit, or something like that. Many people use the acronym, it's very widely used, but a lot of people do not like the term special education because our needs are not special. We both need education, and we should have it in a wider variety. It makes it sound like you're being especially nice to us. Many feel like, and I feel like it's condescending. DX is the last one, and that's just diagnosis. Usually the X is small. Well, thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers in a year and 4,000 watch hours, which is really hard. With your help, I think I can do it. Again, thank you very much. Goodbye.